So, Chapter 4 of Modulo has dropped, and some crazy things are happening. Not only is some mysterious child face-wearing big bad being revealed, but also it appears as though some kind of 2086 alternate version of Rika has dropped. Yeah, you're hearing me correctly. Some form of antagonist has been introduced through Chapter 4 of Modulo, and that antagonist seemingly has an ability that's comparable to that of Rika. And considering the fact that Tsurugi, one of the MCs of the story, wears Yuta's promise ring that he had with Yuta and therefore holds on to the spirit of Rika, most likely, and he's specifically holding on to that ring because the Gojo clan believes he deserves to be protected by Rika, then I believe the stage could be being set in upcoming chapters for the possibility of two spirit guardians battling it out, and the return of the Queen of Curses in a battle against the spirit eerily similar to her. So all that is to say that there is a lot to break down in this chapter, and I cannot wait to get into it. So with no further ado, let's get directly into Chapter 4 of Modulo Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, that is an additional half hour of my face and voice every single week. You can find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to the one-on-one fights, and Shino, well, he's blowing dudes' arms off. But before we get into all that, today I want to talk to you about a game that's dropping a crazy Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles crossover. One of the biggest games in the world is doing a premiere crossover event with Paramount to bring Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, April, and Shredder as legendary champions. Now, what's the game we're talking about? Well, it's Raid Shadow Legends, of course, and they want to help you live out your nostalgic childhood fantasies. Thanks to Plarium for sponsoring this video, and a special thanks to Paramount, because they want to help you kick off your TMNT collection with Michelangelo, who you can get simply by logging in for 7 days after August 21st. And as long as you log into Raid 7 days between August 21st and October 30th, Michelangelo the legendary champion is yours. A legendary turtle who debuffs enemies and taunts them with trash talk, and looks great while he does it. I mean, all the turtles look great, but I love how Michelangelo's nunchucks are spiked to bring him into the fantasy world of Raid Shadow Legends. Not to mention that he's able to light up his nunchucks with fire. Michelangelo isn't the only Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle character you're gonna be adding to your team, because you can also summon Leonardo, Raphael, April, and Shredder through limited time events, and fuse Donatello, who's a top support who's gonna help you keep your team alive and buffed. Not to mention that Shredder is gonna be kicking down the door as an event dungeon boss who you can battle against to get the exclusive Chronophage gear set. But those aren't all the champions that Raid's trying to slip onto your team, because up until October 31st, you can still get legendary champion Sun Wukong by using the promo code Monkey King after downloading Raid. Just make sure you do it within the first 48 hours of downloading the game. But it doesn't end there. When you download Raid using my link today, you'll immediately get a huge starter pack with legendary champion Corrado, at level 10 the epic champion Ugo, at level 20 the epic champion Vergis, and at level 30 the epic champion Tagore. So what are you waiting for? There's never been a better time to get into Raid. Download today using the link in my description or by scanning the QR code on screen right now. And once you're in game, find me using my username on screen right now and pop into my clan, and we'll get to crushing some enemies together. So, Chapter 4 opens with Usami talking to, well, I guess, Team Usami, telling Tsurugi and Yuka that Maru is an alien. However, on account of the fact that literally the first mission that Yuka, Tsurugi, and Maru ever ran, Maru blasted away a child kidnapper using his third eye jutsu ability, which identified him as an alien. Tsurugi and Yuka turn to Usami and say, yeah, we know. And Yuka follows up by saying, we've already talked about it. But Usami doesn't miss a singular stride as he continues on with his speech to Yuka and Tsurugi, saying that Maru is an alien who's been elected by the Sumerians as a special envoy. However, it was established that you guys shouldn't know that he's an alien because that would make this whole thing kind of more complicated. However, we've heard from the Sumerians that apparently Maru revealed to you two that he was an alien. Now, this is interesting because immediately Tsurugi's mind goes back to Chapter 1 when Maru busts out his third eye ability, implying that it wasn't the conversation that Yuka, Tsurugi, and Maru had about Maru being an alien that alerted the Sumerians to the fact that Maru had leaked that information. Rather, what alerted them was Maru using his third eye jujutsu, which makes sense when you consider the fact that Maru talked about how he didn't want to use that ability because the more he uses that ability, the higher likelihood it was passed down to his twin brother. And therefore, it seems that Maru, who probably didn't tell the Sumerians that he used an ability he wasn't supposed to in front of the humans, connected to all of the other Sumerians Sumerians in some way, or maybe just connected to Cross, and therefore the unleashing of his power immediately alerted all of the other Sumerians, or just Cross, to what he had done. Anyways, Yuka breathes a sigh of relief and says, cool, the information has finally been officially released, essentially saying we no longer have to lie about not knowing that he's an alien. Usami chips back in and says, from now on, you three will be conducting high school jujutsu missions as a team of 3. And thus, Team Usami is formed. Now, this is very exciting for Maru, with a giant smile says, got it, I'm on it. However, it's not nearly as exciting for either Yuka or Tsurugi, who are just checking their phone, wrist watches, I don't know. And this upsets Maru, who asks them why there's no excitement about him joining the team at all. However, it's at this moment that Usami pulls Tsurugi to the side and begins to tell him about what he believes are the motivations of the Sumerians, telling Tsurugi that the Sumerians have probably sent Maru down on a mission of reconnaissance, saying that while Sumerians can probably pretty easily break down information about Jujutsu, gathering information on Jujutsu is actually a bit more difficult. And therefore the Sumerians have sent Maru to tag alongside with Jujutsu sorcerers in order to gain as much information about how sorcery works on Earth as possible, so they can break that information down and understand exactly how powerful humanity is and exactly how their powers work. And because Usami understands that Maru, and therefore by extension the Sumerians, are spying on humanity, Usami tells Tsurugi that he needs him to try and glean every piece of possible information about the Sumerians and how their powers work from Maru. Now, it's at this moment that Tsurugi flashes back to what happened in the last chapter, where Maru told Tsurugi all about how he hesitated to act when the child kidnapper was trying to injure the child they were trying to save, not because he believed that his mission was more important than a child's life, but rather because A, he had been given orders, and B, because every time he uses his ability, he runs the chance of that ability being passed down to his twin brother Cross. However, during that conversation, Maru does tell Tsurugi that he would appreciate it if he kept this information a secret, and Tsurugi does just that. And while right here, right now, 2 feet from Maru probably wouldn't be the best time to tell Usami all of this information, Tsurugi still doesn't tell him, so he probably never will. Usami goes on to say that while all of this is very aggravating, unfortunately he's not able to join them. However, Yuka and Tsurugi don't seem all that broken up about it, as they tell him to not only shut up, but also tell him that he's slow, essentially telling Usami that he would hold them back. So I guess comparing them to Team Gojo isn't exactly super accurate, because Gojo is always way stronger than all of his students. We then flash forward on the next page to an elementary school, where we see what appears to be the same little boy being called out in roll call 3 separate times, however in 3 separate outfits. And we see that the teacher who's doing the roll call is terrified of that student. It's at the bottom of this page that it's revealed that a student has re-enrolled in 1st grade 3 separate times. And therefore, apparently, today's mission for Team Usami is to investigate as to whether or not this child re-enrolling in the 1st grade 3 separate times in 3 separate years has any connection to sorcery. Now, Yuka wonders aloud while Mino, who's Usami's assistant, tells them all this information. Well, maybe it's just a coincidence that all of them look alike, implying that the boy who was apparently re-enrolled 3 separate years back into the 1st grade are actually 3 separate children who look alike and have the same name. However, Mino tells them that the teachers have said that they all sound the same too. To which Tsurugi says, well, yeah, but if they all have the same bone structure, then it would make sense that they sound the same, which is like kind of accurate, but most of your voice comes from your larynx, not your face. Continues to wonder aloud, saying, well, yeah, but height also changes a lot at that age. Maybe he's an alien. However, Maru chips in and says, well, it depends on the species of alien. However, my species is pretty similar to your species in that they age and therefore grow rather rapidly in their adolescence. Now, to this point that Yuka decides to ask Maru how old he is, and Maru says, well, on Earth, I'd be 19 years old, which would make him pretty substantially older than not only Yuka, but also Tsurugi. And since in Japan, respecting your elders is a pretty big part of the culture, both of them pretend not to hear him because they have no respect for him, which I don't think is fair. Being a golden retriever doesn't mean you don't deserve respect. Anyways, we then cut back to the elementary school, where we see a homeroom teacher is on one of their temple brain phone calls, trying to get in contact with Masaki, who is the child who keeps repeating's parents. And thus this homeroom teacher is calling Masaki's parents, one of which whose name is Takeda. However, every single question that the homeroom teacher is asking the Takeda, they simply respond to with, yes, Masaki is my son. Yes, Masaki is my son. However, rather alarmingly, eventually the conversation goes off the rails as a long beep is heard, and then the mother from across the line simply goes, hello, 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 and starts talking nonsense about radio exercises and roll calls and asking Masaki if he's made 100 friends yet. And then call is hung up. So clearly something is going on at home. And the entirety of this phone call is played out for Maru, Tsurugi, and Yuka. And while Tsurugi and Yuka are stunned into silence, Maru immediately asks, well, I wonder if Masaki was able to make any friends. To which Yuka responds to by turning to him and saying, what do you mean? We then cut back to the conversation that they're having with Mino, where Mino is running down Team Usami on the situation, as he tells them that every single time Masaki actually graduates the first grade and gets moved up to the second grade, that iteration of Masaki and his parents disappear. And every single year, a new Masaki, but their name isn't always Masaki, shows up with the same face and address. So one Masaki shows up, does first grade, graduates, and then disappears, along with his family. And then a new Masaki with a new name, but the same address and face shows up to redo first grade the next year with a new family. Now this confuses all of Team Usami. But Tsurugi eventually cuts in and says, well, it sounds like a curse user is taking the form of a child every single year and re-enrolling. And while Yuka says, well, yeah, that might be the case, the family is what's truly sticking out to me here, as they were probably killed in order to fit this narrative. And thus Mino cuts in and says, well, yeah, if that's the case, they're most likely targeting family-oriented rental properties. That is to say that some cursed user is finding family-rented rental properties and killing or controlling the entire family, getting rid of the child, taking their form, and enrolling in the first grade. However, even though they have Masaki's address, they're not able to find the landlord of the building that he lives in. Now, Mino continues on by saying that the leniency here is actually kind of terrifying. What this cursed user is doing is incredibly atypical for usual cursed users. They're not acting in the usual way that a cursed technique user would act. And therefore, even though this is officially being called an investigation, there's a high likelihood that Team Usami will come face to face with this cursed technique user. Now, basically what Mino is saying here is that this cursed technique user is acting incredibly rashly. They're openly re-enrolling in the same school, same first grade, with a different name, but same face, same voice, and same address. What they're doing seems incredibly obvious. And cursed technique users are usually pretty meticulous about doing things rather covertly if they're gonna try and be evil. And considering the fact that we're talking about killing a child, taking his form, and either controlling or killing his entire family, that definitely qualifies as evil. And therefore, because this curse technique user is being so ridiculous in how they use their powers, there's a high likelihood that Team Usami is gonna end up in combat against them because they're kind of a loose cannon. Now, Mino goes on to finish by saying, but I'm useless in combat, so I won't be any help on this mission. To which Tsurugi and Yuka both essentially say, yeah, we know you're useless. We never counted on your help in the first place. To which Mino responds to by saying, yeah, listen, I can say that, but you guys can't. You've officially pissed me off. Now, it's at this point that the team splits up into what has quickly become how the team splits up. Kind of like how in Scooby-Doo, Fred always goes and runs around with the girls while Scoob and Shaggy run around with each other trying to build the most ridiculous sandwiches you've ever seen. Team Usami seems to split into Yuka and then Tsurugi and Maru. And I can smell the shippers already for Maru and Tsurugi. Black Cat, Golden Retriever, always together. Yeah, it's a problematic age gap, but that doesn't really matter to shippers. Anyways, Yuka tells the two of them, since they already know Masaki's address, she's just gonna head straight there. So she hops in some kind of futuristic American muscle car and drives away. However, Maru and Tsurugi decide to head to Masaki's school and catch him while he's leaving school. But while the two of them are waiting for Masaki to come out of his school, Maru asks Tsurugi why they don't just sneak into Masaki's school. To which Tsurugi answers to, well, if a battle breaks out using cursed techniques in the middle of an elementary school, what are we gonna do? You have a notorious track record of freezing up around children, and my sword literally lights on fire. Fortunately for both of them, they don't have to worry about that eventuality, as Masaki at that moment meanders out of school. And thus Tsurugi, with his terrifying face that he's kind of just making all the time, pops down next to him and says, you're Takeda Masaki, right? Can I talk to you for a moment? But we see from the POV of Masaki that Tsurugi's face is absolutely terrifying, and he's got a sword strapped to his back, so Masaki tries to run away. And this starts a chase, and Maru scolding Tsurugi for how scary his face is. However, because Masaki is a first grader running on first graders' legs, and Tsurugi is kind of a heavenly restriction user, he catches up immediately. Also, Masaki trips, and that helps. However, before Tsurugi is able to do anything even close to capturing Masaki, something seemingly crawls out of the ground and surrounds it, and it swipes at Tsurugi and Maru as they sprint past it. The two of them are able to duck its blow, while Tsurugi unsheathes his katana. We then in the next panel see a full shot of what appeared behind Masaki, and it's either a Shikigami like the ones that Megami used to summon using his 10 shadows, or a guardian spirit like Rika. But whatever it is, it seems connected to the ground, and it has a series of fibers that connect it to Misaki. It has a chest plate of sorts that holds on to a spool of wire. It has long claw-like hands and a face mask with needles coming out of it. And immediately upon seeing it, Tsurugi gets on the defensive, telling Maru to stay back. As he goes to launch a counter-offensive against this possible guardian spirit, he thinks to himself that judging based off what Usami has said to him thus far, humans are losing in this long, drawn-out information battle against the aliens. And Maru has been sent down by the aliens to determine the true nature of humankind. Tsurugi identifies that the Sumerians are curious about what curse techniques humans are able to access. Goes on to say that while he acknowledges the fact that the Sumerians are spying on him through Maru, that he will not let Maru engage in any kind of combat, and he will not let any harm befall Maru, because above any other directive he's given, the most important thing he can do is avoid war with the aliens. And just as he's done thinking all of these thoughts, going to unsheath his katana to possibly cut down this guardian spirit, Misaki begins to apologize profusely, and thus there's no fight. However, this guardian spirit is incredibly interesting, not only because it looks like a mix of Rika and Judgman, but because the concept of a guardian spirit protecting a child is something that should harken your mind back to how Rika was created in the first place. And the power of these guardian spirits is never anything to scoff at. So whether it's Judgman's ability to strip somebody of their cursed technique, grant a one-hit kill executioner sword, or Rika's ability to copy other people's abilities by consuming them, guardian spirits are the strongest kind of jujutsu that we've really seen consistently in JJK, like the highest end Shikigami, and therefore the reveal of a new generation guardian spirit implies the possibility of a new Rika level threat. And as Rika, and more so her connection to the ring, is a massive talking point of Majula, the reveal of this guardian spirit could be a gateway to bringing Rika back into the fold. But I digress, let's get back into the chapter. Basically, the fight doesn't happen, and we immediately cut to Tsurugi and Maru talking to Misaki, who is swinging on a swing set, while Misaki is explaining to Tsurugi and Maru that 3 years ago when he got home, his mother collapsed. And right about this time, it was time for him to make the second grade change. That is to say, he was going from first grade to second grade. And therefore, after his mother had collapsed and was presumably in the hospital, he kept asking his mother to let him stay in the first grade. After that, his mother became a ghost, or a guardian spirit, and she has been keeping him in the first grade. Now, this tracks with pretty much everything we know about guardian spirits in the JJK universe. You know that if somebody curses somebody else's death or dies with a bunch of regret, they can come back as something known as a vengeful cursed spirit. And essentially, that's what this mother cursed spirit or guardian spirit is being set up to be. A mother whose death was cursed by her son, begging her to do something for him that she couldn't do now that she was no longer alive, and thus she came back as a guardian cursed spirit to make sure that he was able to get the thing that he wanted, which was staying in first grade. Now, Maru chips in and says, wait, specifically, you have to stay in first grade forever? What does that mean? And don't push yourself to answer all of our questions, we're just curious. However, Misaki doesn't necessarily have any way to explain what's going on because he is a first grader, he's a child. Unless Maru says, well, I guess a child your age wouldn't have the ability to explain what's going on. We then get a flashback to Mino, talking about how the leniency of what's going on here is actually kind of scary. Talking about how this curse technique user isn't operating like a usual curse technique user, and therefore they must be some kind of wild gun. However, Tsurugi uses this information from the flashback to realize that, yeah, it would make sense that this person's not operating like a usual curse technique user, because what's happening right now is the result of a child's jujutsu spinning out of control. And thus the carelessness would make sense on account of the fact that a 6-year-old doesn't know how to use this ridiculously powerful guardian spirit, how society would deem as appropriate. And it's at this moment that Tsurugi says something very interesting, as he says, it's kind of like my grandfather's guardian spirit, actively comparing the guardian spirit of Misaki to Rika, and to how this guardian spirit probably isn't as strong as Rika on account of the fact that it wasn't created by somebody who was a descendant of the Sugawara or the Fujiwara, I do not remember which. But obviously Yuto's relation to the Gojo family and his ancestors who specialized in making guardian spirits allowed for him to make a ridiculously strong one in Rika, something that this child probably doesn't have. And thus Tsurugi concludes that given the circumstances, this could be a plausible story, saying that if the family actually went missing 3 years ago, the families from the last couple of years actually could have been fabricated by this spirit guardian, which is crazy. Essentially, what we're saying here is that this guardian spirit, in order to maintain the farce that Misaki has to re-enter first grade every single year, was able to fabricate parents for Misaki. Now, these parents can barely hold the conversation, but still, this guardian spirit was able to fabricate people. However, Tsurugi does admit that that's too much of an assumption to make, and assesses that relying too much on your own intuition can kind of muddy up an investigation like this. And thus he turns to Masaki and says, well then what's your real name? And Masaki says, Masayoshi. Now this leads Tsurugi to realize that all of the names that Masaki has ever given are not only all similar, but also related to the name of the mother who became a guardian spirit, which makes sense. He's a child, his creativity is somewhat lacking. But Tsurugi continues on with his investigation, asking Masayoshi to guide the two of them to his house, and thus he does. However, it's at this exact moment that we see Mino and Yuka show up at Masaki or Masayoshi's house, but the two of them are immediately uncomfortable upon seeing it, and that's justified, because as the two of them begin to walk up to the house, Yuka notices that the lawn has recently been torn up and put back, like something has been buried there, and thus Yuka turns to Mino and says, Mino, Tsurugi should be here soon. Let's dig up right there. With the last panel of this page being both Yuka and Tsurugi shocked by something. And then the next page, we see Yuka holding on to a skull that a plant has grown through. And we see Tsurugi, Maru, and Masayoshi sitting or standing next to a hole that Tsurugi has dug. As Tsurugi says, it's the mother's corpse. Well, I guess that makes sense. You're a child and you probably buried this corpse by yourself. It'd be hard for you to move this corpse very far, so it makes sense that it's still on the property. And now it's at this point that Maru begins to muss up Masayoshi's hair and said, this all must have been tough for you. You did well. Now Masayoshi turns to Maru and says, am I gonna be arrested? To which Maru says, no, nothing like that. At which point Tsurugi chips in and says, if you don't have parents, you'll be sent to the academy. And there you'll be trained in how to handle cursed energy. But Masayoshi says, but where am I supposed to come back to? At which point Maru says, well, like he said, the academy. At which point Masayoshi says, well, what about my house? Can't I come back here? At which point Maru begins to relate to Masayoshi, saying, yeah, it's unfortunately not that simple. Truth is, I also don't have anywhere to go back to. Familiar scenery, the house full of memories. I've lost it all, and that emptiness will probably never be filled by anything. Once again enforcing the idea that Maru and all the Sumerians were forced out of their home by some greater force, and they'll never be able to return to their home planet. However, Maru at this point in time says, though one day eventually I might be able to fill that hole when I become somebody's friend. Now it's at this point that Masayoshi says, well, what's a friend? And this is obviously a way to harken back to the conversation that the homeroom teacher had with the created parents of Masayoshi, who were apparently pestering Masayoshi into making 100 friends, something that maybe Masayoshi's parents did back in the day before they died. Now to this point that Maru with a smile on his face says, well, they're companions who understand why you cherish the things you find the most important. In order to help you understand that, first Masayoshi, how about you become my friend? And I'll do my best so I can become your friend. However, it's this point that Tsurugi gets a phone call, and it's Yuka on the line screaming at him, asking where the hell he is, which is confusing because while we hadn't exactly seen the two of them together, they were both pulling corpses out of Masayoshi's yard, and therefore it'd be safest to assume that they were together. However, this establishes that they are not. However, Tsurugi lets Yuka know that he's at Masaki's house, or Masayoshi. However, Yuka lets Tsurugi know that she's also at Masaki's house. Now this confuses Tsurugi, who yells, huh? And Yuka yells at Tsurugi that Masaki is shady as hell, as she screams at him that in her lawn that they were digging up there's 5 corpses, and probably more to come. And thus she tells Tsurugi that if he comes face to face with Masaki, to take him down immediately. However, it's at this point that we see that Masaki, or Masayoshi, has already knocked out Maru, and while standing over him and staring at Tsurugi, he begins to peel off his face as he turns to Tsurugi and says, do you have any friends? And we see as he peels off this face of a child that he's kind of like Harvey Dent's Two-Face, with half his face appearing youthful and the other half appearing very old. And thus for the first time in Majuro history, an antagonist has been introduced in one chapter and not taken out in the same chapter. And thus we might be experiencing the introduction of one of our more long-running antagonists right now, which considering the fact that he is a guardian spirit that was able to conjure multiple families and possibly multiple houses using barrier techniques and pocket dimensions, it stands to reason that this Masayoshi could be a ridiculously powerful sorcerer. However, as to how powerful, we unfortunately won't know until next week. But you can bet your bottom dollar I'm real excited to find out. What did you guys think of this chapter? What do you think about the reveal of a new guardian spirit akin to that of Rika? Let me know in the comments below. And while it goes down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I'm genuinely curious to hear how everyone feels about this JJK spinoff. I'm loving it, but I don't really consume discourse about manga that I read because I don't care what other people are feeling. But like, I want to know what you guys are feeling because I care about your opinions. I just don't care about the people that I don't know. I mean, I don't know you either, but here is love.